In this new chapter, she no longer looks outward for role models because she has become one. She no longer asks the world to show her her worth because she carries it in every step, every breath, every boundary, and every act of self-respect. She's not seeking the woman she once needed. She is her now, and that may be the most powerful thing she's ever done. Her strength isn't just in how far she's come, but in how she uses her journey to create light for others. Whether it's through her words, her energy, her boundaries, or her story, she becomes an anchor. Not perfect, not invincible, but grounded, real, fully herself. She stops apologizing for her sensitivity. She no longer hides her intensity, her intuition, or her softness. What was once used against her is now her greatest asset because it allows her to feel deeply, to connect genuinely, to live honestly. Most importantly, she makes peace with her past, not because it was fair or painless or forgettable, but because it shaped her into the woman who can now stand with open hands and an open heart and say, I am not who they said I was. I am who I decided to become. Not because everything went right, but because she kept showing up day after day, even when no one was watching, even when she was scared. She starts to trust her voice, not just for herself, but because she knows what it's like to be silenced. She honors her boundaries because she remembers how it felt to be constantly overrun. She nurtures her dreams because for so long, her survival came before her desires. She encourages others, especially women walking through their own storms, because she remembers what it felt like to have no one in her corner. And through this deep remembering, she transforms into a sanctuary for herself and sometimes for others. She doesn't try to save people, but her presence speaks loudly. I've been there, I see you, and you are not alone. In the final, most empowering phase of her transformation, something extraordinary happens. She begins to embody the version of herself that her younger self so desperately needed. She no longer simply heals for herself. She becomes the protector, the guide, the nurturer, the voice, and the strength that she wished someone had been for her during her darkest moments. She becomes the living proof that it's possible to rebuild from the ashes, not as the person she once was, but as someone even more whole, more grounded, and more aligned with truth. This becoming doesn't happen all at once. It emerges slowly, through the weight of experiences carried and the wisdom gained through pain. She remembers the days she cried alone, the moments she begged the universe for answers, the nights when she doubted she would ever feel joy again. And now, when she looks in the mirror, she sees someone who made it. The people who hurt her may never see her growth. They may never acknowledge the damage they caused, but she doesn't need them to. She's no longer building her life on borrowed validation or unfinished conversations. She's building it on truth, on trust in herself, and on the quiet knowing that she doesn't need closure to heal. She only needs courage. And she has more than enough of that now. She closes the chapter not because the story was neatly tied, but because she is ready to write a new one. She stops waiting for someone else to admit they were wrong so that she can feel right. She no longer seeks comfort in what's broken. She chooses clarity instead. They didn't love me the way I deserved. That is enough. That clarity hurts, but it also heals. She reclaims her narrative. She lets the pain become her teacher, not her identity. She forgives, not for them, but for herself, so she no longer carries the poison of resentment. She accepts that there are some things she may never understand, but she no longer lets that uncertainty keep her stuck. And in that act of emotional independence, she gains more than any apology could ever offer. She gains herself, her strength, her clarity, her future. She becomes grounded in her own truth, unshaken by what others refuse to own. And then one day, quietly, she chose differently. She chose to stop giving power to people who had already shown her who they were. She chose to stop searching their silence for signs of remorse. She chose to stop rereading old messages, overanalyzing conversations, or wondering what she could have done better. Not because the pain didn't matter, but because she did. Her peace did. Her future did. She began to understand that closure is not something others give. It's something she creates. It's the boundary she builds, the truth she tells herself, the decision to move forward without needing anything more from those who never valued her fully to begin with. And in doing so, she becomes her own closure. One of the most liberating and painful turning points in her healing journey is when she finally stops chasing closure from those who broke her. At some point, she realizes the apology may never come. The explanation may never be given. The answers she thought she needed might remain forever withheld. And while that truth stings at first, it becomes the fire that forges a new kind of freedom. Because she stops waiting to be released by someone else. Instead, she releases herself. There may have been days, weeks, or even years where she replayed the pain, searching for what went wrong, wondering why someone treated her that way, hoping that one day they'd wake up, see her worth, and make it right. That longing kept her emotionally tethered to people who had already walked away, or worse, stayed without care. She thought closure would heal her, that it would be the missing piece to make sense of her suffering. But the longer she waited, the more exhausted she became. Each day she rises, not perfectly, but faithfully, not without emotion, but without abandoning herself. And that is what healing really is. Not an end, but a homecoming. A way of being in the world that is rooted in awareness, grace, and fierce self-respect. Because the woman who rebuilds herself alone doesn't heal to become someone else. She heals to return to the truest version of who she's always been. And through this daily practice of showing up for herself, she reclaims something that was once taken from her. Trust. Trust in her body, trust in her emotions, trust in her ability to hold space for herself. She no longer needs someone else to save her from the hard days. She becomes her own sanctuary, her own comfort, her own source of safety. Her healing becomes an act of rebellion in a world that often tells women to be quiet, to get over it, to move on quickly. She chooses instead to feel, to grieve, to process, to unlearn, to rebuild. And in doing so, she models a new kind of strength. Not one that pretends the pain didn't happen, but one that transforms that pain into wisdom, softness, and self-knowing. She builds healing into the rhythm of her life. It may look like morning stillness before the chaos of the world begins, like drinking water when her mind tries to spiral, like closing her eyes and breathing through memories that still visit her at night, like choosing not to answer a call from someone who used to hurt her, like forgiving herself for not healing faster. These are not grand gestures, but they are acts of profound courage. They are her quiet commitment to self-respect, made again and again. She stops rushing the process. She stops comparing her timeline to others. She stops believing the myth that she should be over it by now. Instead, she honors the depth of her pain and the layers of her journey. She starts to understand that healing is cyclical. Old wounds may reopen, new lessons may emerge, emotions may come in waves, but instead of fearing these moments, she learns to meet them with compassion, not judgment, not shame, just presence. As she moves through the delicate and powerful process of rebuilding herself, she slowly begins to understand that healing isn't something she arrives at. It's something she lives with. It's not a mountaintop she reaches one day, triumphant and finished. It's not a clean, linear journey with a clear endpoint. Healing, for her, becomes a daily ritual, a sacred, ongoing relationship with herself that is tender, intentional, and ever evolving. At first, this truth is hard to accept. Like many, she hoped that healing would be a point in time, that one day the pain would be gone, the past would no longer sting, the triggers would disappear, and she'd feel completely whole again. But over time, she realizes healing isn't about erasing the scars. It's about making peace with them. It's about learning to live with herself in softness, even when the old wounds ache. It's about showing up day after day, not to fix herself, but to care for her. And through this inner shift, she no longer fears being seen. She doesn't shrink to keep others comfortable. She doesn't dim her light to fit in. Instead, she radiates authentically, quietly, boldly, because she knows her worth doesn't require an audience. It just requires her own acknowledgement. In learning to celebrate herself without permission, she takes back what was always hers: the right to be proud, to take up space, and to feel deeply deserving of the life she's rebuilding. On her terms, in her time. 4. Celebration becomes a spiritual act, not for the ego, but for the soul. It affirms that she no longer waits to be picked, chosen, or affirmed by others to feel complete. She affirms herself. She claims her space. She allows joy in, not because everything is perfect, but because she is no longer punishing herself with perfectionism. She also learns to detach from the cultural narrative that tells women to stay humble by staying invisible. She no longer feels guilty for taking pride in her growth. She understands that her celebration is not arrogance. It's evidence that she's alive, aware, and honoring what once felt impossible. She knows now that celebrating herself doesn't mean she thinks she's better than others. It means she finally realizes she is enough. As she is, no one claps for these moments. There are no cameras, no crowds, no social media highlight reels. And yet, they matter deeply. So she starts to honor them, not with fanfare, but with presence. Maybe it's a quiet acknowledgement, a whispered "I'm proud of you" to herself in the mirror. Maybe it's lighting a candle and sitting with gratitude. Maybe it's writing in her journal, tracking her evolution, not in grand achievements, but in emotional honesty. She also learns to stop minimizing herself, to stop brushing off her success with phrases like, "It's not a big deal," or "anyone could have done it." No, she did it. She endured. She changed. She chose better. That deserves to be seen, especially by herself. She stops needing others to validate her worth because she finally realizes she is the only one who lives her entire journey. Only she knows the depths she's risen from. Only she knows how hard it was to choose healing over numbness, self-respect over codependency, truth over silence. But one of the most transformative shifts a strong woman makes while rebuilding herself is learning how to celebrate her own growth without waiting for someone else to notice, validate, or applaud her. In the past, she may have relied heavily on external affirmation to feel worthy. She may have waited for praise from others to feel seen, or for approval to feel like her progress was real. But now, in this sacred process of rebuilding, she learns that her journey is too personal, too powerful, and too profound to be dependent on outside applause. She begins to notice the small victories, the mornings she gets out of bed despite the heaviness in her chest, the boundaries she holds even when it's uncomfortable, the days she chooses peace over proving herself, the nights she comforts herself instead of chasing validation. These moments might seem ordinary to the outside world, but to her they are extraordinary. They are proof of growth, healing, and inner transformation. And as she redefines strength, she becomes more whole. She allows herself to be multidimensional, to be powerful and tender, to lead and receive, to build and to rest. She makes peace with the fact that she doesn't have to be everything for everyone. She only has to be honest with herself. In doing so, she liberates herself from society's outdated script. She becomes an example of a new kind of strength, one that is not based in suppression, but in authenticity, one that does not conform, but creates space, one that doesn't burn her out, but builds her up. She no longer carries the expectation to be perfect, invincible, or always strong. Instead, she gives herself permission to be human. And in that humanity, she discovers a resilience that cannot be taken from her. She learns that real strength is not about being unbreakable. It's about being soft and still surviving. It's about feeling everything fully and still choosing to move forward. Strength is allowing herself to grieve without rushing the process. It's having the courage to confront parts of herself that were hidden for years. It's speaking up when her voice shakes. It's saying, "I'm not okay." This strength is rooted not in how much she can carry, but in how deeply she knows herself. It's not performance, it's presence. She no longer needs to prove anything. She no longer finds identity in endurance. Instead, she finds power in alignment. She honors her intuition. She honors her cycles of growth, her seasons of rest, her inner truths. Her strength becomes fluid, responsive, and deeply personal. For most of her life, she was taught that strength meant never breaking, that it meant staying composed, being invulnerable, carrying burdens without flinching, and enduring silently. She was praised for how much she could take, how well she could hold it all together. But somewhere along the way, perhaps in the quiet aftermath of personal pain, heartbreak, or exhaustion, she realized that this definition of strength wasn't sustainable. It wasn't even true. In rebuilding herself alone, she begins to rewrite what strength means. It no longer looks like smiling through the storm or pretending everything is okay. It looks like pausing when she's overwhelmed. It looks like asking for help, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. It looks like setting boundaries that disrupt old narratives and walking away from roles that kept her trapped in survival mode. In the silence of her solitude, she made peace with herself. And now, in the presence of others, she chooses to be seen, not because she needs to be saved, but because she wants to be real. She shows up fully, knowing that she is not less complete without them and not more complete with them, just whole regardless. This is the paradox she learns to carry. She is both independent and deeply connected. She can receive love without losing herself in it. She can stand alone without pushing everyone away. She can accept help without feeling weak. And she can be part of a community while still being entirely herself. Because in rebuilding herself alone, she discovered that the most important relationship she'll ever have is the one with her own soul. Every other connection is a beautiful addition, not the foundation, but the light that reflects what she already carries within. At the same time, she also becomes willing to let go, to walk away from those who drain her, disrespect her, or who only loved the version of her that was quiet, compliant, or self-sacrificing. Rebuilding herself often comes with a painful realization that not everyone can come with her. And though grief may accompany those losses, she learns to accept them as part of her evolution. She understands that loneliness is not failure, it's a passage. And through that passage, she finds her people, those who see her, not just what she offers. But even with this newfound connection, she doesn't outsource her power. She doesn't wait for someone else to give her direction. She doesn't make decisions to gain approval. Community becomes her support system, not her compass. It gives her rest, reflection, and encouragement. But she knows the journey is still hers to walk. There's a deep shift that happens when a woman reclaims herself. She no longer seeks validation in others the way she once did. The applause no longer means as much, and the criticism no longer stings as sharply. She values support, but she's not addicted to it. She starts to understand that while love and encouragement are powerful, they are not replacements for self-trust and inner knowing. She begins to nurture her relationships differently. She seeks out people who speak truth, not flattery. People who listen without trying to fix her. People who honor her boundaries and respect her healing pace. These connections become sacred. Not because they fill a void, but because they reflect her growth. She stops chasing connection out of loneliness. Boundaries do not disconnect her from others, they reconnect her to herself. They allow her to choose relationships that are mutual, respectful, and life-giving. They teach her the difference between what is healthy and what is familiar. And perhaps most importantly, they create the space she needs to truly rebuild, not on shaky ground, but on a foundation of inner safety and self-trust. In learning to say no, she finally says yes to herself. In learning to say yes, not once, but every if she begins the process of rebuilding herself, the strong woman often finds herself in an in-between space, alone but not entirely isolated. She may crave connection but fear dependence. She may value relationships but no longer want them to be the foundation of her identity. In this new version of herself, she learns an essential truth. Community can uplift her, guide her, and hold space for her, but it cannot complete her. I identify as a community who does not complete her. Community can uplift her. It cannot do the inner work for her. It cannot define who she is. She begins to notice how much lighter her life feels when she's no longer absorbing the emotions of others. She becomes more intentional with her time, more discerning with her energy. She no longer entertains chaos or emotional manipulation disguised as love. She no longer overextends herself to prove her worth. She stops explaining her choices to people committed to misunderstanding her. Her boundaries become filters that protect her from emotional noise so she can hear herself more clearly. And slowly, those boundaries create a new kind of freedom. A freedom where she is no longer defined by obligation, guilt, or fear of disappointing others. A freedom where she can rest without apology, love without losing herself, give without being emptied, and dream without asking for permission. Setting boundaries becomes her act of self-respect, not loud or aggressive, but clear, firm, and rooted in deep self-awareness. She begins to ask herself, what do I need? What drains me? What restores me? And most importantly, what am I no longer available for? It isn't easy. Boundaries challenge old dynamics. They disappoint people who were used to her self-sacrifice. Some may call her distant, cold, or unkind, but she learns that the discomfort of holding a boundary is far less painful than the cost of living without one. She no longer sees boundaries as rejection, but as redirection, a way of telling herself, I matter, my needs matter, my healing matters. For the woman who chooses to rebuild herself alone, boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are sacred lines drawn to protect her peace, energy, and healing. After everything she's been through, whether it's betrayal, abandonment, burnout, or personal loss, she begins to recognize that self-preservation is not selfishness. It is survival. It is healing. It is the quiet discipline of protecting what she is still learning to value within herself. Before, she may have said yes too quickly. She may have prioritized the needs of others over her own. She may have tolerated disrespect, manipulation, or neglect just to keep the peace, to feel loved, or to be seen. But rebuilding herself requires that she do something radically different. It requires that she choose herself. And perhaps the most powerful part, she gives herself grace during the rewriting. She doesn't expect perfection from her new story. She knows some chapters will still be hard. Some days will still feel uncertain. But now she's the one narrating it. Now she's the one choosing which pages to turn, which words to keep, and which scripts to finally let go of. Because when a woman becomes the author of her life, she doesn't just survive, she creates. She builds a life that's not just lived, but deeply felt. She no longer chases worth, she defines it. And in doing so, she doesn't just rebuild herself, she reclaims everything she was always meant to be. She starts designing her life, not out of fear or compliance, but from a place of alignment and clarity. Self-authorship also means that she holds herself accountable. She no longer blames others for her stagnation. She doesn't wait for external rescue. She understands that no one is coming to save her, and in that truth, she finds power. She gives herself permission to evolve, to grow out of relationships, to change direction, to disappoint others if it means staying true to herself. This is a space where she can find truth. She becomes the editor of her boundaries and the architect of her healing. For the strong woman who rebuilds herself alone, self-authorship is essential. She's often emerged from a place where her voice was silenced, her dreams minimized, or her identity overlooked. She may have been the caregiver, the partner, the pleaser, the perfectionist, roles that served others but drained her spirit. And so, her rebuilding begins with authorship, with claiming her voice, her desires, her beliefs, even when they challenge the status quo. It's not a neat process. It's messy and vulnerable. She questions everything. Her values, her friendships, her habits. She unlearns patterns that once kept her safe, but now keep her small. She revisits parts of herself she once dismissed. She honors the dreams she once buried. She becomes intentional with her thoughts, her choices, her vision for the future. There comes a defining moment in every woman's life when she realizes she no longer wants to be a character in someone else's story. She no longer wants to be shaped by expectations, limited by roles, or defined by how others perceive her. Instead, she takes the pen into her own hands. She becomes the author of her own life, a storyteller of truth, pain, purpose, and growth. Self-authorship is not about rebellion. It's not about rejecting everyone or everything she once knew. It's about returning to the core of who she is, stripping away the noise of the world, and finally asking the most powerful question of all. Who do I choose to become now? Not who am I expected to be? Not who am I expected to be? But who am I beneath it all? The nonlinear nature of resilience also exposes her to grace. She stops comparing her journey to others. She stops measuring her value by productivity or perfection. She begins to trust that her pace is her own, and that it's okay to move slowly, to move sideways, or to stand still when necessary. Because the woman who rebuilds herself understands that resilience is not a destination, it's a rhythm, it's a heartbeat. It's a promise she makes to herself, not once, but every single day. And each time she breaks and rebuilds, she doesn't become weaker. She becomes more fluid in her own strength, more rooted in her own truth. That's the beauty of nonlinear resilience. It doesn't just restore who she was. It reveals who she's always been becoming. Every breakdown becomes part of the map. Not a sign that she's lost, but a reminder that healing takes time and that becoming whole isn't a race. This nonlinear journey teaches her things that the straight path never could. She becomes more patient with herself. She starts listening more closely to what her body and heart are telling her. She discovers that strength isn't just about pushing through. It's also about knowing when to pause, when to breathe, and when to rest. And maybe most importantly, she learns that falling apart is not the opposite of growth. It's often the beginning of it. There are days when she wakes up full of determination, ready to conquer the world. And then there are days when getting out of bed feels like a mountain. There are moments when she's proud of how far she's come, only to be followed by moments of self-doubt so loud they drown out every previous victory. Resilience, in her case, is not the absence of struggle. It's the decision to return to herself again and again, even when she's tired, even when it's hard, even when no one sees her trying. She learns that progress doesn't mean never falling. It means learning how to fall softer, how to get back up quicker, how to be kinder to herself when she stumbles. She begins to realize that the backward steps don't erase the forward ones. Every detour, every delay. By choosing vulnerability over denial, she invites in growth, self-trust, and clarity. She doesn't numb the pain. She learns to live beyond it. This is how she begins to rebuild, not as someone broken, but as someone whole enough to hold both her pain and her promise in the same breath. And in that breath, she rises. By choosing vulnerability over denial, she invites in growth, self-trust, and clarity. She doesn't numb the pain. She learns to live beyond it. This is how she begins to rebuild. Not as someone broken, but as someone whole enough to hold both her pain and her promise in the same breath. And in that breath, she rises. There's a pivotal moment in every journey where pretending no longer serves us, where we stop wearing the armor and instead sit down with the truth. That moment, though frightening, is where transformation starts. For the strong woman, vulnerability becomes her tool, not to be rescued, but to rescue herself. She stops waiting for others to understand her pain and instead uses her own self-awareness to understand herself more deeply. She begins to heal by telling the truth, first to herself, and then, if she chooses, to the world. That healing is radical because it doesn't rely on external validation. It's not performative. It's internal, slow, and deeply personal. She doesn't post every step. She doesn't shout it into a crowd. She lets the silence do the work. Her vulnerability becomes her power. Her honesty becomes her compass. And her openness becomes the very thing that leads her back to her strength. When we talk about strength, especially in the context of a woman rebuilding herself alone, society often imagines a cold, stoic figure, someone unshaken, untouched by emotion. But in reality, true strength doesn't come from suppressing feelings or pretending the pain doesn't exist. It comes from facing that pain head on, acknowledging it, and allowing ourselves to feel it deeply. That's where healing truly begins. Vulnerability is often misunderstood. People assume it's weakness, when in fact it's the rawest form of courage. It takes immense bravery to stand in front of your own life's wreckage, to pick up each broken piece and say, "This is mine. This is real. And I will rebuild from here." A woman who chooses to rebuild herself alone is not hardened by her pain. She's softened into someone who has learned to trust her own process, to sit with discomfort, and to move forward even when the outcome is uncertain.